This is Modern Political Philosophy. It's Tuesday morning, and this is, let's see if the video lecture last week, the first lecture on Locke, was to make up for the lecture that we missed when most of the class came back from Washington. That's last week. And then, in some ways, for the 2.5 periods that we've watched the death of Stalin, the lecture I posted on Sunday night was to make up for one of those, and this lecture is to make up for when I was ill last Monday. And so I think this week we'll meet in person tomorrow on Wednesday the 20th, and then remember. Friday is both a Jewish holiday and convocation. Technically, I think our class could squeak under the line for convocation. But I don't think Dunn is... No, I think Dunn is probably canceling his class, but I'm not sure. So I will post another lecture, and that will probably... this lecture that I will post this morning will probably take us through Locke. And that should enable you to pass in your response papers on the death of Stalin this evening. So tomorrow we'll probably finish up Locke, and I'll sort of sketch out Rousseau. And so you should be reading, for the rest of this week, Rousseau's first discourse. So if you're looking at the notes that I passed out, which are an updated and expanded ones from March 30th, and the ones that I passed out yesterday in class on April 13th, on the second page, let's continue where we left off in my last lecture. So to summarize, human beings in the state of nature are not incessantly fighting, and their psychological constitution is not structured for incessant violence. Rather, nature puts an abundant menu of resources in front of the primitive human race to some degree, and even now Locke would say this is true about labor, and then creates in our bodies an equal equality and freedom. No natural rule over us, except in chapters 6 and 7 when he discusses paternal power. But he makes clear, by the way, that what he means by paternal power is not some sort of absolute dictatorship over one's children. Parents don't own their children's. Rather, they are temporary stewards. And when natural equality brings the ability of the child up to that of the parent, natural equality kicks in. And for that matter, as I mentioned in my previous lecture, this is also true between men and women. Both Hobbes and Locke, I think this is just bearing out the natural implications of the concept of rights, which reduces human beings to a kind of a radical individualism, which is another way of saying that our natural state, as nature creates us before society modifies us, and before, in Locke's case, property modifies us, and as I'll say in a preface to Rousseau, for Rousseau, as living in society modifies us. All the moderns agree that there's no natural foundation for association, for connectedness, for love, for politics in human life. We're radical individuals. The universe just doesn't support human attachment, human association, and certainly political life. Political life is completely artificial and simply serves the aims of our preservation. And if I may say at this point, again, the reason for reading Machiavelli at the beginning of modern political philosophy is that the subsequent thinkers, some of who take the suppositions of Machiavelli's thought and develop it to remarkable philosophical complexity, as we'll see in Nietzsche, and to some degree in Marx, and certainly in Locke and Rousseau, yet they really are operating within the same universe. It is a universe of fortune and chance, and then the name of fortune and chance, by the time you get to Bacon and Descartes and Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, shifts to nature. And and what you could say where we are in this stage of modern thought is nature provides a kind of a platform for a reform of the distortions of human consciousness and politics that have, up till this point, culminated in universal political exploitation and tyranny, religious superstition, which has left the human race oppressed and unequal and impoverished. So remember, there is both a philosophic thrust to all the thinkers that we are reading in this course, in the sense that they believe they are laying out the true foundations of human identity and the nature of the universe, correcting some mistakes by their predecessors, rejecting the broad approach of the religious traditions of humanity and ancient political philosophy. And at the same time, you could say that their vision of nature is providing no support for political rule, for political authority, for connectedness, for family, for hierarchy. You could say that that there is a reformist thrust. Their aim isn't just theoretical and philosophical; it's political. It's to actually change the political condition of humanity and social condition of humanity. And so, and the way that they do this is, so there's this interesting connection with nature, between nature, something called nature, the wider universe and the forces around and in us, which these thinkers appeal to as a kind of a source of truth, to demolish the traditional and customary arrangements of human life, either on the personal, private, family, and certainly on the political level. And each one of these thinkers thinks in some ways that not only has their thought brought us to genuine philosophic clarity after thousands of years of philosophical, religious, cultural, and political distortion, that each of them, I know this sounds a little vain or a little hubristic, but each of them kind of believes that their set of concepts is the final access to the truth and will reorient human beings rightly in this universe. Now, the price to be paid for that is a universe that supports our identity, our connectedness, our association, and in some ways our moral identities. And all of you saw that very clearly in the central and critical chapter 15 in Machiavelli's Prince, when the purpose of that chapter and the rest of the theoretical dimensions of the Prince was to show that the external universe in no way supports what we call virtue or moral judgment. So we're adrift in a blank and desperate and dark universe. It will become most evident when we get to Nietzsche, because Nietzsche will come right out and say the universe that we live on is a chaotic and dark and hostile abyss to our identity and provides no foundation for human life, except, and this is the sense in which the early thinkers, including Machiavelli, Descartes, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, this tenuous connection between the way that nature constructs us as needful beings, alive, desiring life, with a natural attachment to life, which is sort of like the individual embodiment of the principle of inertia of matter and motion. So there is a sense, and the central moment in modern thought is when that new view of the universe and the new view of human beings takes decisive shape in Hobbes's Leviathan, because it's in Leviathan that Hobbes creates the critical concept that links us with our nature, and that's the concept of rights. And as we've already seen in Leviathan, we'll see in Locke, we'll see in Rousseau, what that reveals, there is enough that we learn from nature about us. The first thing we learn is that all our prior arrangements, religious, cultural, scientific, philosophic, political, familial, culture, whatever, are all without foundation. The only foundation for our lives as human beings that nature provides is in our life and our desire to remain alive, which Hobbes, as you know, reformulates as the conceptual concept of rights, which reveals us to be naturally equal and free and independent of each other. And that means that any social, any familial, any social, any cultural, any political arrangements are completely artificial and designed by the reason of human beings. Now, that obviously pushes the question of where the reason that makes us distinct as human beings come from. Unlike the ancients, unlike the religious traditions, which see the difference of human life and the basis of human identity rooted in some external foundation, whether it's the rational order of nature, which points to ends and purposes and therefore guides us in our personal identities and our political and communal constructions. The moderns reject all that, rejecting both the religious basis and the philosophic basis of a distinct human identity and the capacity for reason expressed in the unique human capacity for language and speech. So all of these thinkers, especially starting with Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, these great middle modern thinkers that are the bridge between what Cropsey calls classical modernity and radicalized or reformed modernity in its subsequent stages. They all turn to the question of how we come to acquire this unique capacity for reason. And for purposes of understanding both Descartes and Hobbes and Locke in front of us, and even Rousseau, they all kind of agree on what reason is. It's the power to see, and let me give a provisional definition that you'll see will resonate through Locke in our subsequent comments today and on Wednesday. So reason is a kind of a perception of the world. But as Hobbes reveals in Leviathan, it doesn't come from our natural construction. The only thing that nature puts in us is passions, sensation, passions, memory, imagination, and some trains of thought. Speech and reason are acquired artificially. Now, Hobbes is fuzzy about that, and that becomes the basis of both the Lockean critique of Hobbes's state of nature, and not just the violence versus the other psychological traits, but as an explanation of how human beings come to be distinct from animals, acquire this power of reason and through speech. And you're going to see as Locke's answer to that, as I made it evident in my previous lecture, is Locke's argument is it's labor. It's labor, work, and property that starts this dialogue between the human animal and the external universe that eventually becomes more complex as the objects of our labor and the nature of our property becomes more complex, and we begin to see relations in the world that our labor makes possible, both through the act of appropriation and making something ours by mixing our bodies, our body in with an external object, the private aspect of private property, but then the addition of value, which means the transformation of natural potentials into actual useful objects. And by the time that Locke gets done with Chapter 5 on property and the source of value in the objects, again, it turns out that although he starts out by apparently saying nature is generous to everyone and there's so much and we're so few and our needs are so equal and free and little, and nature puts a limit on our acquisition of property through waste, yet and it seems as if it's just a Garden of Eden out there, but Locke ultimately undermines that, and as you're going to see, like Hobbes, he argues the correction for our natural insufficiency, that nature is insufficient. It provides us with rights and needs, but it doesn't provide us with the circumstances, the environment that we need to acquire and keep secure those needs. For Hobbes, it was so radical, it was just to stay alive. We're so violent and conflicted and in a constant state of war that we need a political authority, the sovereign, and the more absolute the better, to subdue the proud, human, crazy, natural animal that will otherwise end in endless war and destruction. Again, as I mentioned in my lecture yesterday, the previous video, Locke sees that as a distortion of how nature makes us. Nature makes us needful and gives us rights to do it. But it's primarily not through the activity of fighting other humans, trying to dominate them, and which in some ways is a continuation of the natural state of war. For Locke gives, again, a more nuanced, layered, and you might even say different stages of the state of nature. Originally, when we're small, laboring animals, acquiring on a personal level, there's so much resources which have no value until a human labor is added to it, that our natural condition is equal and free, but not warlike yet. It's penurious. Locke eventually undermines the notion that the state of nature is a happy place. So when we do a comparogram, which will stretch forward to Rousseau, and we'll see, you can line these thinkers up this way. What is a human being by nature? All of them, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, in that order. All of them say by nature human beings are equal. All right. The second characteristic all of them see is free and independent. equally equal, equally free. And then a good way to compare these three thinkers on then what they see that condition as is whereas Hobbes says human beings are free, equal, free, and miserable. His famous 5-word description of the state of nature is solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. And Locke, equal, free, and poor. Now, you could say for Locke, but aren't we happy because we're busy laboring in a way? Well, nature forces us to labor. Nature not only gives us the right to labor, but if we don't labor, we remain in this kind of ostensibly generous but very stingy condition. Once we start applying our labor to the external natural world and begin transforming it through artificial labor, it suddenly becomes valuable. And our labor is what adds usefulness to human beings in end. We are the commodity acquiring and generating human beings. And that process of transforming our environment through labor, that becomes something like what Marx will eventually argue is how our own productive energies is what transformed us and developed us into a species. So in some ways, it becomes like a proto-anticipation of Darwinian evolution, where circumstances change human nature, like all nature. I mean, Darwinian natural evolution means that the chance motions of fortuna or nature are actually what develop all things in nature. It's just chance. And in some ways that's what leads to human beings. And this process continues then once human beings begin to apply themselves to the environment. And that's what Locke thinks he has added to Hobbes's bare and inconsistent account of human nature. It's labor and property that become the mechanism, the dialogue between, and Locke is quite explicit about this in chapters 5, 6, and 7, that as we labor on different kinds of resources, different kinds of property are generated. And that interaction between us, our needs, our labor, and the environment is what begins to develop our capacities. And I think this is, and begins to have an effect on the human being. Whereas sexuality and maternity, as Rousseau will argue, are not necessarily social instincts. Locke would argue that the stabilization and transformation of human life through property is what actually begins the first initial primitive associations of human beings. Labor begins to transform sexuality and maternity into stable relationships. So property and acquisition is not only the primary natural need and natural response to our niggardly environment and a sort of poor environment that looks abundant, but only until human beings begin to actually transform nature does it become comfortable and commodious and useful to us. So much so that by the time that Locke gives his account of value, it starts with 1 as a 10. Nature provides 1/10 of the value, human labor 9/10. Then by the time that equation is done in chapter 5, it turns out that nature provides 1/1000th, and human beings provide 999 out of 1,000% of the value, and then 1/100,000. So I mean, human labor effort and the improvement in the quality of our commodities is what kind of begins to pull us up by the bootstraps, begins some complex vision of the world, and leads to the stabilization and beginning of human society. All still, until the invention of money, all limited by and guided by the law of nature, which again Locke sees as a naturally lawful place. By the law of nature, he means the right to engage and the command to engage in acquiring property to address our needs, and this is where you're going to see the kind of parallel between Locke's state of nature and his state of civil society. So instead of the chaos, violence, and the state of nature that Hobbes sees, which leads to the absolute political authority that the sovereign is in Hobbesianism, Locke sees a kind of a milder state of nature, as I've said many times, in which human beings are primarily working rather than fighting. And it's only when things get scarce and unequal because of the invention of money that the state of nature now probably becomes a state of war, in which the primary threat is to your property and your ability to hold on and to keep what you've acquired. So in some ways, Locke's state of nature, it becomes a kind of a proto structure for civil society. And you'll see what I mean by this. Because since the law of natures is acquire, you have the right to acquire, to defend what you acquire, and when you're not busy acquiring yours, and this is where I think Locke sees the psychological and historical openings to the beginnings and expansion of society, not just in terms of the expansion of property that changes the nature of the human family, but for Locke, it's critical to argue that human beings can maintain society without a common sovereign. Why? Because there is an activity called trade or commerce that actually grows out of our own productive activity. And it's this, and we begin to see. We begin to see that actually being with other human beings may not necessarily be a painful or warlike thing, unless they try to take what we've acquired away from us. Then we may fall into fighting. But it's critical for Locke to establish that society can exist without a sovereign. You'll see that this will lead not only to his construction of a different sovereign, but ultimately when he supplements Hobbes's, he replaces Hobbes' requirement of absolute obedience, which of course for Locke becomes a form of slavery, which again he says is impermissible by nature. You can't by enslave yourself to another human being. Now we can talk about how Lockeanism became commodious enough to because both Northerners and Southerners appeal to Locke in some ways. So there's a kind of an opening for what eventually came to be the institution of slavery in America. Both interestingly enough, condemned by Lockeanism and with a certain openness to Lockeanism. We'll come back to that in subsequent discussions. But my point here is that it's critical for Locke to show that human beings can associate with these others without a common sovereign. And what's the basis of that association? It's commerce. In other words, our reason now, when we go through different, and he talks about different schemes of property and the different kinds and degrees of property, we begin to see relations in nature. And this is why this transformation of the human person is where reason and language come from. Remember, the philosophic contradiction that both Locke and Rousseau see in Hobbes is you have human beings being reasonable to get out of nature, but which requires language. But if we're not social, how can we develop language? Where does language come from? Where does reason come from? If we're isolated, naturally independent, and we don't associate with each other, language and reason are all in some ways the products of society. So Locke's mechanism to show how society could exist without a sovereign is property, meaning commerce and exchange. Now, it's when exchange becomes complicated enough on a certain level that we invent money. That's what suspends and destroys the original equality. But the irony in Locke, again, is by destroying that natural equality of property, it actually increases the abundance that we transform nature. So in some ways, for Locke, the movement away from natural condition is in the direction of inequality, but also abundance, which leads to his great phrase that a king in America is clothed worse than a day laborer in England. There may be inequality, economic inequality in English society, Locke will admit, but you're going to see he'll rationalize that inequality and say that actually it benefits our original equality of needs, because the more different kinds of commerce and property and the more inequalities of wealth, then the human instinct to acquire is given both incentive and goading. And by all of us working harder to acquire property, it turns out we increase the collective and individual abundance of human society. So moving away from original stinginess and equality leads to social and economic inequality. But for Locke, that's a good thing, because that's what unleashes our capacity to transform natural resources and impute labor in them. And that's his comparison to like bread and the steps and clothes and everything like that, as opposed to the conditions of human primitive life. So we're going to see this is controversial, and Locke and Rousseau, our next thinker, will pick right up on it. And you're going to see that the beginning of Rousseau's criticism of both Hobbes and Locke, and especially you could say emergent modern commercial scientific society, is yes, you may be wealthy, but you're not happy. You can be rich, but you can be miserable. That simple phrase is going to see is kind of the opening to Rousseauianism, the radical reformulation of the foundations that Hobbes and Locke provide, and the movement in the direction of the radicalism of Marxism and Nietzscheism and existentialism. So if you're looking on the notes for April 13th, that's what I summarized yesterday and the day before, and also the notes up to now. So I want to start with what I want to do in this lecture essentially is to lay out his political teaching. Instead of the absolute sovereign, the mechanism of which works by members of civil society being terrorized into obedience, and therefore creates the conditions of peace that don't exist. In some ways, the Hobbesian alternative is structured fear versus chaotic fear. The structured fear that the sovereign provides versus the chaotic fear that nature provides. Locke, again, really rejects that. And as I said prior to our finishing up the movie yesterday, Locke really would say, no, Stalin is worse than the state of nature. Slavery is worse than going it on your own. And besides, slavery, you are not naturally permitted to enslave yourself. He will make the distinction between biblical drudgery and slavery. Slavery means to put yourself under the absolute power of another human being. And this is the principal foundation of his critique of the Hobbesian sovereign. That Hobbes's political solution is in fact a kind of absolute slavery to a sovereign. Locke will provide a different version of nature, as we've seen, which will lead to a different version of political power. Because we need political power. Locke eventually will say that the state of nature does become untenable, and that it probably will lead to a state of war, primarily over property. And therefore, you need some kind of artificial entity to come into being that nature doesn't supply, that will bring peace by securing the right of property. Of course, the right to survive. Because the reason we form property, the reason we need liberty and property, life, liberty, and property, is because the liberty is a means to the life, and the property is generated by and a means to the liberty and to the life. So this triad of rights, life, liberty, and property, are, in Locke's terms, nearly identical. You can't have life without liberty. You can't have life without property. And the liberty that we enjoy as nature is to acquire as much in different kinds of property as we can, limited by law of nature, changed by the invention of money. So on one level, it's the rise of political power. But let's be clear, when we start laying out Locke's political teaching, how similar and profoundly different that is from what Hobbes sees. So remember, in the state of nature, Locke says it's a law of nature. You work hard, acquire, get what you want, keep what you want, defend what you want, and when you're not busy killing others who are trying to take your property, you can sometimes trade with them and help them. So there's kind of a mild opening to beneficence and sociality there. But then Locke says what defines the state of nature is everybody is his own executive. So Locke already starts to see a kind of a division between the natural functions of law and the executive, the legislative and the executive. There's a kind of a natural legislative in the law of nature, but then the natural executive is each human being alone. And as you're going to see, by keeping a kind of parallel state of nature, state of civil society, nature is each individual human executes the law of nature. As we transform to civil society, Locke actually says what political power isn't just the power to create an artificial sovereign over you. It's the power to create law. Locke's critical solution, a reformulation of Hobbes's political teaching, is to create a political condition which generates the power that politics needs. Politics is power, but generates it in such a way that it actually moves towards rational safety rather than personal whim. Because remember, this is the great problem with slavery in the state of nature and tyranny, as Locke will come to describe it at the end of the second treatise. It turns out that because the problem is every human being is a packet of self-interest and passions. And if you put yourself completely under the power of another human being, you're forgetting that human being is just a bunch of junk like you, and so just as self-interested as you. So the problem is the Hobbesian political solution abstracts from or ignores the fact that the people that we give political power to are shits, just like the rest of us. And one of the things that power does, it starts increasing their sense of self-interest and turns them into monsters that exploit the rest of us. So the Lockean problem becomes, how do you generate the common rule and power, common power, that constitutes politics, that gets us out of the state of nature and secures our property and stops us fighting, at the same time that you don't create a terrible instrument for our own enslavement and self-destruction. You can't create a cure that's worse than the disease. And Locke's solution to that, as we'll just lay out then today, is not to say that the power to create civil society is the power to create power. It's the power to create laws. And we'll talk about why law is better than personal whim or discretion, and Locke's alternative to legal rule, to rule by law, in which we essentially define ourselves as beings that create promulgated artificial law, understand it, live by it, but then we also create a common executive. So because law without execution is nothing other than an idle recommendation. And that's in some ways what the problem that happens in the state of nature, even for Locke, because even though there's a law of nature that guides us in some ways, it's kind of fuzzy and our reason is pretty primitive. And for law to really work, the human mind, through reason, has to actually fatten. So let's talk about reason and law right now, and you'll see this redound back to Locke's state of nature and forward to his political teachings. Reason. Let's talk about reason again, because Locke develops this idea, and especially in his understanding of how a rational creature creates law. What's law? It's a general principle. That means you're seeing a common principle or thing, an identity that exists among a class of things. That's born of reason. Now you're going to see reason, and by the way, this goes back to Aristotle and Plato, and to some degree even Hobbes. Hobbes thinks that when the human mind comes to produce names through language, it starts to group things together into classes. And so what the power of reason is the power to see similarity or class resemblance, but then uniqueness that distinguishes. So similarity and difference is the full extent of human reason. Locke will try to bring that human capacity. So there's kind of like a psychological foundation, not just in the passion to acquire and have property, but also in the capacity of reason that is beginning to develop artificially over time in history. That's why, as I said in both the previous and opening and yesterday's discussion, that for Locke, the historical evolutionary character of a state of nature is critical, as it will be for Rousseau. So once human beings acquire this capacity to see the relations of things developed through property and commerce, they can actually now they can promulgate laws. And that's why Locke defines political power not as the power to create a common power, but the power to formulate law that binds and regulates our common interest, which is nothing other than our amalgamated self-interest. Remember, Mondragola, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, all of the moderns all argue that nature essentially puts self-interest in us, and the question is how to channel that self-interest. So the common good, as we saw all the way back to Mondragola, is not by formulating some transcendent view of human beings. It's finding a basis by which we can all pursue our natural interests, our self-interests, now called rights, by the way, in a condition that is more conducive as a means to the ends of our achieving our self-interest. So the modern solution, and you'll see this is true even in Marxism, is not to ask human beings to know and love a common good. That's different from their individual self-interest. It's to formulate a common good that serves as a rational instrument to their self-interest. And even Marx, who will preach universal communism, argues that what that really is every human being pursuing his or her self-interest in a global association of socialized productive property and common feeding. So, I mean, in some ways, this Machiavellian notion of no natural foundation for our associations and moral distinctions, but rather a natural foundation for our channeled self-interest. The question, as this thought emerges, is how to channel that self-interest. What is that self-interest, and how to channel it into social and political life. So, for Locke, we begin with political power to correct the insufficiencies of a state of nature, because we want property, acquire property. Property comes unequal through money. And so what we need is some way of distinguishing legally and rationally between your property and my property. And that's why we create civil society, create laws, general principles, standing settled rules. This becomes critical. Because for Locke, law, standing, settled general principles that we all ascribe to and create awakes a different psychology in the human being. It encourages more of this rationality, this artificial rationality that we acquire and becomes the basis of our common life. The alternative to standing, settled, general rules of law for the basis of political power is personal whim. And so Locke's politics is an either or. Either you have rational power, rational laws as the foundation of political power, which are general, accessible to the rational mind, shared by the members of community, and therefore have a kind of an intrinsic restraint and safety in it. Let me give you a quick example. If I was the professor of this class, God forbid, and I announced that grading in this class is going to be based on standing settled rules that you can know and understand, and in fact the last page of my syllabus, as required by Congress's regulations, show those. If I instead said, the grade you're going to get is based on how I feel and like about you at the time that I feel and like and give out the grades, which would you feel more comfortable in? Under a structure in which your action is guided by a general, knowledgeable, rational principle that you can achieve, or by simply making me happy and avoiding my wrath? So that's why political power is kind of an either-or for Locke. Either it's going to be founded in this kind of rational general principle known to all, formulated by all, and which in some ways we all give our consent. So politics is based on consent. We consent to lay down our individual executive powers. We consent to create a common, explicit, what Locke calls promulgated, which means natural and visible, law that binds society. And we also then give up our individual executive power and turn that over to the artificially created executive. Now, the new executive you're going to see, because that's the second part of Locke's political solution to create power, but not unlimited power, and not tyrannical power. Again, I'm going to say this is the Lockean task, to create a political power that will not become tyrannical, so far as you can make sure. And that is through the rule of law, through constitutional separation of powers and constitutional structures that give you a guide between the different kinds of powers that government exists, the subordination of the executive to the legislative, we'll talk about that, and to give to the populace. This was the third part where I said Locke replaces Hobbes' no right of resistance or revolution with a milder right of resistance and revolution. And in the last couple of chapters of the second treatise, he gives you a condition by which constitutional government begins to deteriorate through, first he calls it usurpation, when one branch of the government begins to try to take over the power and exceed its boundaries, and then gives to the population the right to alter and abolish or alter the government. And of course, there's a direct line to the direct Declaration of Independence. This is all right out of the second treatise. So, in some ways, let's go back then to the rule of law. So, in order to make sure that political power it doesn't round it in the personal self-interest of the ruler, Locke says political power isn't the power to create power. It's the power to structure power through law. Without law, the state of civil society is worse than the state of nature. Stalin is worse than anarchy. And then in chapter 11, and by the way, what's the purpose of this? The purpose of creating politics, political legal power, is to secure our property and to lead to a comfortable and happier life in this world. So, which includes survival, to be sure. But our main motivation as natural creatures is not to kill each other and to attack and take over. Our primary natural, and we will defend ourselves when push comes to shove, but our primary natural passion is to escape our natural poverty through working hard, generating property, and therefore the purpose of political power. So what's political power? Power to create and pass through majority rule of equal human beings at the beginning. Political forms and constitutional forms don't have to be democratic, but there is a kind of an implicit natural democracy that Locke says. Because if we're all equal and free, the only way that we can get together and move society as a whole, like a physical force, is the analogy with which side of a teeter-totter is going to be tipped. Well, it's where more weight is put. If you have a bunch of equal and free human beings, the only way to create a common movement is by creating a majority force. And that's why Locke says the initial movement of consenting to create a legal structure for life and political power has to essentially be by a kind of majority rule. So Locke already concedes, by the way, that the moment that everybody agrees to start forming a political society, you already got majority and minority. You have to. That's the only way to create a common power. And that kind of means that the minority has to accede to the authority of the minority. That's how the whole premise of civil society forms. So in chapter 8, 9, and 10, he distinguishes between tyrannical first of all, paternal power, general paternal, which isn't an ownership or absolute tyranny over children or wife. It's a paternal power, which he says is both maternal and paternal. We've got to remember that. Is a responsibility and a power over children because they're naturally incomplete. That ends when the completion of natural growth is over. And once you grow up and get your own credit card, then you are the natural equal of your parents, and they lose the right to rule your life. Now, through honor, respect, and yes, through historical society, we're so stupid, we weren't rational, and we started to turn paternal power into kingship, and that screwed everything up, and then we projected religious blessings on it. So Locke's account of the transformation and rise of civil society and how it got so screwed up is not unlike Hobbes's in chapter 11 of Leviathan. So we realize that the only way that we can bring peace to our condition, secure our property, and allow the rich to keep theirs and the poor to acquire theirs, is through law that establishes property boundaries and secures the existence of property. So political power is the power to pass laws to secure property and render life in this world, the Machiavellian impulse of terrestrialization, in this universe. So in chapter 11, after in chapter 9 and 10 defining political power as the power to make law, and so in my notes under E, and I noticed, by the way, that E looks a lot like D, and it's so difficult to distinguish the letters of the alphabet. So the difference between the state of civil society and the state of nature for Locke is there's law and execution in the state of civil nature. The law of nature executed by individual beings. So the difference between, and the great correction of our natural condition through the artificiality of government and politics, is law now becomes explicit, promulgated, formulated, and visible by the members of society, and we now pool our individual common power together to create a political executive. So again, not a movement from anarchy to sovereign power, but rather a movement from individuals executing the law of nature with the mess that entails, to individuals promulgating now artificial laws, but more visible, effective, and because they're visible and formulated, and our common reason generates them, and a common executive power that will keep us to our legal covenants. So in chapter 11, this is a critical thing, and it has a profound influence on on American constitutional theory. Locke creates 4 intrinsic limits to the legislative power that human beings could put over them. And in the bottom of the second page of the notes, these are all from chapter 11. These are principled limits on legislative power, from paragraphs 135, etc. 1, law can't be arbitrary. It has to conform to the purposes of the law of nature and be general and impartial. So it can't be arbitrary. It can't be lacking in rational foundation or common principle. The first aspect of reason, to see commonality, has to be the basis of the law. Second, the laws promulgated by the legislative authority have to be standing and settled. They can't change with the arbitrary whim of an absolute ruler, because then the population never knows what's coming next. So standing settled laws are critical for the containing of political power, because if I have a rule that determines how I grade you, you as the gradee can apply to that rule, and you can even say that I haven't followed my own rule. But if I simply say that the grade you get is the result of my personal whim, arbitrary desire, my passion, and my self-interest, you have no way of knowing except through pleasing or avoiding displeasing me. You've put myself under slavery. So legal rule is the alternative to personal whim. And it got to be, so the second limit is standing settled laws. The third, you can't deprive through legal means not just to have the form of law as a general principle that protects everyone's and defines everyone's property, you can't take people's property away without their consent and under principled and structured ways. That eventually becomes the Due Process Clause in the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment. Nor shall anyone be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And Locke would say that also means we can't. Because what's the purpose of creating law in society? It's to preserve your property. Therefore, if you create a world in which your property can be taken away from you at the whim of someone else or a sovereign, that's worse than the state of nature. Hence, Beria and Stalin and all the other monsters that ran the Soviet Union. And last, it can't be delegated. Once you create a body to create law, that body can't transform the power to make law into another body. That is the non-delegability of legislative authority. That still survives in our Constitution and is part of our constitutional law. Much of the original New Deal legislation was declared unconstitutional because the Supreme Court held that what it did was it transferred the power to make laws from Congress to the executive branch by granting too much discretion. That still is a potent doctrine in our constitutional law, and it comes from the Lockean teaching that if the legislature delegates or gives away its power to make joint and formulations, especially, of course, delegating too much discretion to the executive, then you turn legal rule into simple administrative fiat. This issue is working out in our own politics right now in terms of pandemic policy, inflation policy, and other aspects. It creates the internal tension between the Congress and the president, legislative, executive, that is at the heart. And let's turn now to the second dimension of Locke's political teaching, the separation of powers. Locke argues that the functions of government can be divided into three broad categories: making a law, enforcing law, and you'll see Locke executive power also includes judicial power, because if reason is the power to see both generality and specificity, the power to create general rules for society comes from the legislative or general part of reason. But when you apply them, we're going to see this in Locke's very interesting doctrine of prerogative. But there are species within the genuses, the individual cases. We know that even if, and I've used this analogy in grading, if I have a formal rule for grading and it says no makeups or whatever, there will always be individual circumstances that don't seem to fit that general law. Out of that comes the unique power of what Locke calls in Chapter 13 prerogative, which will be very interesting. Now, so Locke would argue that the power to enforce and judge the law is executive power. Then he says there's this other function of government which is relating to other sovereigns, which he calls the federative power. And that's the power of war and peace, contracts, alliances, and that's what we would generally call the foreign affairs power. I already mentioned in the previous lecture that by the time this doctrine gets to the Americans, it's been reformulated by Montesquieu, who divides the foreign affairs power, what Locke calls federative power, up between the legislative and executive, and then divides the executive and judicial power, because he says giving the same power to enforce and interpret the law to the same set of hands will naturally lead to tyranny, which, of course, by the way, the idea of the Montesquieuian invention of the independent judiciary is in some ways one of the core foundations of modern constitutionalism. The first thing that went in Nazi Germany and the first thing that went in communist Russia was the independence of the judiciary, and the judiciary simply became, in both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, became an instrument of political oppression. So it's the structural separation of the executive, the judicial from the executive, and the executive from the legislature that creates the conditions of safe power. Not just legal foundations, but the actual institutions of government have to be. Now here's an interesting question. Why three powers? Why does this doctrine of separation of powers generate three powers? Well, one is, first, remember, the principle is you can't have absolute unrestricted power in any human being or group of human beings. That turns us into monsters. And that when you destroy the rational foundation, the legal foundation of our own personal life, and take away the rationality of law, then we just become unrestricted monsters. And therefore, you've got to prevent that concentration of all power. In fact, the definition of tyranny by Locke, of absolute uncontained power, becomes in Montesquieu The definition of tyranny is the concentration of all power in one set of hands. You've got to prevent that. Well, how do you do that? You've got to divide it. Well, how do you divide it? Why not 19 powers of government? I think there's a prudential balance here. You've got to have more than one power of government to prevent the concentration of power, but you can't have 19 branches of government or 19 powers, because then you're back to kind of a chaos. So I think the separation of powers is three: legislative, executive, federative, and Locke, and legislative, executive, judicial, and Montesquieu, who we're not reading in this course, but who I think is intelligible through my arguments. You see, three is enough to provide balance and division of power, and yet not so great that it generates chaos. That's one way to think about it. The other one is that the division of functions of government, making law and executing and interpreting law, roughly correspond to the different functions within reason. Seeing generality and rising above individual interest and passion, and on the other hand, seeing the specificity of individuals and individual circumstances. Now, to finish up, it's actually, so let's take then. So once you have the rule of law, the mastery of the legislative power, you have to subordinate the executive to the legislative, because you have to subordinate passion and interest to law. Now, that's all very good, and we can talk about how that works out in the American Constitution, because that's something that Locke doesn't seem to really formulate. That's really contributed by the American founders, the idea of a written constitution that stands out and above the actual legislative government. Locke's thought theory actually had a profound influence on the British Constitution through the supremacy of the Parliament. And indeed, the great jurist Blackstone kind of Lockeanizes the English common law and constitution. And after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, where King James II was chased out and were replaced by William and Mary through an act of succession by Parliament, legislative parliamentary supremacy really is the principle of the British Constitution, the Queen and the Crown notwithstanding, because the royal right to rule is recognized by parliamentary law. So there really was a change in the British Constitution from the Tudors and Stuarts to the Hanoverians and the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which meant that both America and Britain are kind of Lockean regimes, but because we created this additional device of the written Constitution, the rule of law has a slightly different operation and institutional status in us. So on one level, Chapter 13 is interesting on prerogative, because what he admits is, when you formulate a general rule, the problem is you can't anticipate everything. Every law, every general principle is kind of a prophecy of the future, an attempt to control the future. But life's complicated. And that's why Locke creates in the executive in Chapter 13 this interesting power to rule without law or to step outside the law, and that is inherent in the executive power. Now, obviously, isn't that kind of like letting the genie out of the bottle? Isn't that kind of like saying, okay, the legislative law is supreme and the legislature is supreme, but the the executive can set aside law or rule without it, or create exceptions? Haven't you just reintroduced the genie of whim? Well, the way that Locke tries to let the genie of executive discretion to meet emergency circumstances and to interpret the law in unique conditions is through the doctrine of prerogative, which he says is the natural right of the executive, but it has to be temporary, and it can't ultimately displace the supremacy of the legislature and the rule of law. So what justifies it? The executive has to resort to emergency to justify this unusual exertion of power, or to the uniqueness of circumstances. And so Locke says, well, but what happens if there's a conflict between the legislative and executive? As it is with the issue of revolution at the end of the second discourse, I'm sorry, the second treatise, Locke says, the people shall decide, or they appeal to heaven. So Locke creates a situation where the executive has the power to apply law to individual circumstances, that will eventually become judicial power, and to govern in emergencies that the law hasn't anticipated or in specific circumstances. But it's got to be temporary, and eventually, and here's what leads to the conclusion, and I'll finish up with this to complete. The third triad of Locke's political solution is not only the rule of law, constitutional structure, powers and forms, and separation of powers, it's ultimately the right of resistance and revolution in the last chapters. Because once you set up the structured constitutional basis of government, Locke then tells the populace So how do you know if this is keeping to its original purpose to secure your property right? Well, first of all, if the executive especially starts to extend prerogative into permanent emergency rule and sets aside the rule of law, that's your first signal that something's gone wrong. So second, if one branch of government starts to try to take over the constitutional powers of another part of the government, Locke defines that as usurpation, and that's the second standard or hint that something's gone wrong here, and that the government that you created to secure your lives and property is actually turning into an instrument for the destruction of your lives and property. And last, when the especially probably the executive branch, but when any part of the government starts to arrogate to itself unrestrained absolute power, which he defines as tyranny in the last chapter, then the people have a right to resist, because, and here's why the beginning of Locke's teaching is connected to the end of Locke's teaching. Because society can exist without common political power. Remember, Locke's milder state of nature where commerce generates a possible society. That means you can still dispense with the actual authority of government if it becomes destructive and tyrannical and still have society. So you're not immediately thrown back into an original and chaotic and violent state of nature if the population resorts to a common sense of society to resist tyrannical power and to restore constitutional government or to alter the forms of government. So there you have Locke's political teaching based on his reformulation of human identity and the state of nature. In all, if you're looking at the last page of the notes, in general, Locke's enterprise is Machiavellian, as was Hobbes, to direct our attention away from the other world to this one, as reflected in the aim of politics, not to save your soul, but to save your body and make it more comfortable. It's Hobbesian that Locke accepts the concept of rights, the non-naturalness of politics, even original society, with the focus of politics being the securing of rights through the creation of sovereignty, except with the aim specifically being the preservation of property. In addition to the specific modifications of Hobbes' teaching mentioned above, one could say that Locke in general tries to make the pleasures of acquiring, having and acquiring, the theme of life rather than the pleasures of fighting, domination, and surviving. It is really proto-capitalist in the sense that the aim of society is to allow each individual the unlimited acquisition of property under law, with politics tamed so that government will not threaten property or life, and make its acquisition easier and its retention guaranteed. Society may have classes now which didn't exist in nature, rich and poor perhaps. But this is necessary for the whole thing to work. Law protects the wealth of the wealthy from the poor, but also allows the poor to work to rise above their poverty, goaded on by envy of the rich. So everybody is out for themselves to get more. In some ways, this also becomes the engine of technological and scientific progress, and Locke anticipated this. Although the full connection between science and economy will be spelled out by later thinkers like Locke, David Hume in the Scottish Enlightenment, and Adam Smith, also in the Scottish Enlightenment, who really are the founders of modern free market capitalism. But there you have the Lockean vision of human beings, politics, and society. And we'll continue with this discussion in class on Wednesday.